Hello and welcome to another one of my videos where I'll be taking a look at AMD Fluid Motion Frames on the newly released official 24.1.1 Radeon Driver. I have done Fluid Motion Frames videos in the past, multiples, and I found that the generated frames were kind of blurry and overlapping with the real frames, resulting in an image quality that personally I didn't really like. So my conclusion was that it's not really ready yet. And I found in a game like a Forza Motorsport, for example, it worked pretty well on that one. So we're going to take another look today on multiple games, newer games, and see how it looks. For this, I'll be using my 175Hz Alienware QD OLED display. And this is the one with the G-Sync Ultimate module in it. So it doesn't have FreeSync. However, it does support adaptive sync. You just have to enable it on the Radeon Driver, and it works just like a FreeSync display, no problem. Anyway, let's get to the games. We're going to start with the game Jusant. But before I do that, I just want to explain the metrics overlay so you guys can follow along. And we're going to be using the RivaTuner statistics server, which I've enabled just now. However, this is not going to be able to pick up on the generated frames because they're driver generated. We have to use AMD's own metrics overlay, which I've kind of tweaked for you guys so you can follow along. Right here, I just enabled it. At the very top, it says FPS 80. So right now we have Fluid Motion Frame disabled. So the game's running at 80 FPS. That's what we're seeing. Once I enable Fluid Motion Frames, you will see the total amount of frames on the AMD's overlay FPS section at the very top. Okay, that's how it works. So right now we're getting 80 FPS, and the reason why is because I have set an 80 FPS frame rate limit. Reason is because my monitor is 175 Hz. So I don't want to go beyond that and introduce screen tearing. I want to be within that range so that when we turn Fluid Motion Frames, we're doubling our FPS essentially. Okay, so right now the game actually looks very, very smooth. 80 FPS, very consistent frame times, no problem. So why don't we try turning it on and see if we spot anything. Here we go. If you press Alt, Shift, and G, that enables Fluid Motion Frames. If you press it again, it disables it. So right now we have Fluid Motion Frames enabled. And if you look at the top there, it says 160 FPS. So that's the total frames, including the generated ones. Do I notice anything unusual? Not straight away. But I do notice where the pipes are on the wall. When you move the camera, there's a bit of a jitter, which it's most likely assets overlapping onto one another. Is it that distracting though? Not really. So that does stand out to me, but the rest of the picture actually looks very smooth. No problem. Why don't we continue moving forward? Now, everybody's threshold and annoyances are different. For me, for example, I find flickering, that kind of irritating personally. I find it kind of annoying. So that does bother me a bit, but someone else might not care at all. I know some people like a softer image, some like a sharper image, some like a more native image. So right here, when I move the camera around, you can see the pipes at the end of the ramp. They're kind of like jittering. But interestingly enough, the other pipes actually look pretty good. So from what I remember, the preview driver's Fluid Motion Frames was actually a lot worse with this, from what I remember. So this, I definitely see an improvement, although I did not test this game, so I can't know for sure. But why don't we look at it in slow motion? Okay, I wanted to show you guys something here, and maybe you can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So right now we're in my editing software and we can actually see the generated frames. Right now on the far ramp we have a real frame. If we move over, that's a generated frame. You can see it breaking apart, and it's like it breaks apart, then it's a real frame, then it breaks apart, then it's a real frame. However, I do see an improvement overall because if you look at the rest of the image to our left of the screen, you do see some blurring of assets and some overlapping, but it's not nearly as bad as the distant pipes. And I believe that is because that is distant geometry. So when the camera is panning, that is what's moving from point A to B the furthest in relative to, you know, the other assets on screen. So I do believe that's why the algorithm is having trouble generating it exactly the way it should be. from what I remember, AFMF, looking at it months ago, it was actually way worse than it is now. I mean, there was whole spots of the screen that were complete blur, and it looked terrible. So I would say this looks much better on Jusant. For some who have attention to detail, it definitely can stand out. But I just wanted to show exactly, it's these type of frames that add up, and they're in sequence with real frames that stand out, and you know, you might catch it. It might be distracting to you. I don't know, but for me, it essentially looks like just part of the image or a particular asset. It's like stuttering. It's unusually stands out compared to the rest. But in Jusant, it's actually, while you're playing, it's not that noticeable. It's actually pretty good. Okay then, so back to the game then. What do I think of Fluid Motion Frames in Jusant? Actually, I think it works pretty well. Yeah, there's a couple things that tend to stand out when you move the camera around, but the game is pretty slow paced. It's a chill, relaxing, good vibes game. Anyway, let's go on to the next game. Next game then will be Robocop Rogue City, and we're using the maxed out settings essentially because we're able to stay above 60 at 3440 by 1440 natively, and we have around 65 FPS. Now, I have a feeling it might not be great here just because, especially if you play with a mouse and keyboard, right? You're gonna kind of do flick shots, and even though Robocop moves slowly, you are gonna move the camera rather fast. So how's it gonna look with AFMF on? Well, let's check it out. So right now it's off. We're gonna turn AFMF on, and we've essentially doubled our frame rate, 135 FPS, okay? Now moving this way, left and right, it's okay. I am noticing these bars here kind of overlapping onto one another when you move left and right. But the problem is, if you look at the frame rate on the AMD overlay, is that, say you're running around, right, trying to shoot an enemy, you're going to turn. Now when you turn, that triggers it off rather consistently. So see how it's dropping to 70 FPS if you look left and right. So I say, why don't we try the controller, because that does smoother camera motions. And yeah, immediately I can see these bars here when you move the camera left and right. It's almost like they're merging into one another, even before it triggers off, actually. So I think that's probably why they're triggering it off, because if you turn too quickly, it probably doesn't look great if they were to leave it on. But other than that, it's just these thin lines, you know, like these metal bars or fences, stuff like that will normally overlap. What would I rather do? Would I rather enable AFMF to go from 60 to 120? I don't think I would use it in this game personally, because I could just use XeSS, because FSR doesn't look great in this game for some reason. They still haven't fixed it. So check this out. We put XeSS on quality, and we're getting 100 FPS. I think this looks much better than turning AFMF on, where you get, you know, assets overlapping onto one another, just because of the nature of the game and how you would have to play it. And as a PC player, you know, for me, I would use a mouse and keyboard, which would cause AFMF to turn off and on, just because the nature of how we use a mouse is usually we make quick turns. So yeah, I think XeSS at quality is a better option here than using AFMF. That's my conclusion for Robocop anyway. But I don't know. Why don't you guys let me know what you think down below. On to the next game then. Will be Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which is actually kind of unique because this game has FSR3 frame generation and a pretty good implementation of it. However, I won't be using RivaTuner Statistics Server here because I ran into issues with frame generation when having that enabled. So we're just going to use the AMD overlay, which is fine. It should serve its purpose. But let us go over the settings first here. Run the game at 3440 by 1440 with FSR3 set to ultra quality. Frame generation is currently off, and we're running on the ultra graphical preset. Okay, this game is pretty demanding, so and we're getting around close to 60 FPS, right? And yeah, I mean, the game feels all right, not too bad. I'm using a keyboard and mouse too. I think this is a pretty good base frame rate to turn FSR3 frame generation on, so why don't we try that first, and then we'll see how AFMF feels compared to FSR3 frame generation. And the game feels actually much smoother now, definitely. And we're getting 100 FPS. So yeah, we're latency wise, it feels like a 50-60 FPS experience, but motion fluidity feels really nice, very smooth. Definitely an improvement over without frame generation on. So let's try AFMF. We're going to begin by turning off FSR3 frame generation, and then I'll be enabling it. So here we go. All right. So we're back to 60 FPS. Here we go. I'm going to turn frame gen on now. And I threw a grenade. Great. All right. So here we go. Now we're at 100 FPS. Yeah, I'm seeing blurring of all kinds of assets as soon as I move the mouse. As a matter of fact, I'll probably do a slow motion for you guys so you can see, but I'm seeing aliasing essentially on those lines across in the distance when I move the mouse. And I'm trying to move the mouse slowly so I don't turn AFMF off. If I go too quickly, it's going to turn off, and then it's going to try to catch back up, which leads to these like ramping down and ramping up scenarios, which are kind of unavoidable if you use a mouse to play shooters or anything like that. So yeah, I would say panning the camera around definitely doesn't look nearly as good as FSR3. Now, does the image look smoother as far as motion fluidity? Yeah, it does actually. Definitely looks better from that perspective than with frame generation and AFMF off. But you get these like overlapping assets when you move the camera around that it doesn't look great. I'm using the controller now, so if I move the camera around, these plants in front of me here, they essentially begin to blur whenever I move the camera around. So that's kind of what I'm saying with some of these games and turning AFMF on. It's like the motion fluidity can look better sometimes, but the image degradation is too much, at least for me, because now you're losing detail. You're adding blur, essentially frame blurring. Like, look at these here. If you move the camera around, it's essentially like they envelop in a cloud of blur. It's almost like I have double vision. That's kind of what it looks like. Like I have double vision. Anyway, though, to wrap this video up, what are my thoughts on AFMF? Well, I think it's improved since it first launched months ago with the preview drivers. It's definitely gotten a bit better, but I still see the same type of flaws that I encountered when I first looked at it. And it works better in some games and not so great in others. Like Jusant, it worked pretty well. In Avatar, not really. I don't think it looks good when you turn it on, but with FSR3 it looks great. So it just kind of goes to show how important that game engine data is for frame generation to work as well as it does. Now that FSR3 frame generation's gone live, though, I think it's just a matter of time before it's integrated into a bunch of games, even retroactively into older games, just like FSR2 was. So that is great, because FSR3 frame generation in Avatar works really well. It didn't work well for me in Forspoken, but in Avatar, if it works, if it's integrated like that in other games, I think it'll be good. And that is going to improve even more, as these technologies tend to do. But I think AFMF is probably best at home. If you're already getting around 90 or 100 FPS and you have a high refresh rate display, you can just toggle that on. You have a bunch of real frames to begin with anyway, a good low latency, and then that kind of complements it by giving you more fluidity. I think that's where this feature works best, personally. So that is my thoughts on it. But it is a feature that AMD has that NVIDIA does not, which is great. Great to see. But yeah, that's what I think. I was going to look at a few more games, but I didn't want the video to get way too long. But I hope you guys enjoyed this look at the AFMF currently on the 24.1.1 driver. If you did like the video, give it a like. If you want me to check out some other game, let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more content. Bye-bye.